and welcome to the latest episode of Climate Pioneers. I'm Heather Clancy, the editor at large at Trellis, and I am going to be interviewing someone from a company that has been part of my life, my entire life, actually, Mars. The $50 billion maker of Ben's Rice, Pedigree pet food, and of course, M&Ms. That's where my dad used to work. And one of the reasons that I've invited this company to be part of the series is because they've managed a cumulative greenhouse gas emissions reduction of 16% since 2015. They're aiming for a 50% cut by 2030. And the thing that's really extraordinary about that is they did that while growing a lot. And so I've asked one of their executives from the sustainability team to join us today. Kevin Rabinovitch is the vice president of global sustainability, and he's the chief climate officer at Mars. In his LinkedIn job description, he says his goal is to help others on their journey towards understanding what sustainability means to their roles and companies. Kevin, thank you for joining us on Climate Pioneers. Hello.
Very happy to be here and great to speak with you again, Heather.
Right. So that being said, yes, I have had the opportunity to speak with you before, but I'd like to get a little personal with the first two questions and just understand a little bit more about like how you operate at the company. First of all, who's your boss?
So I work for a gentleman named Barry Parkin, who's our Chief
Hmm.
Sustainability and Chief Procurement Officer here at Mars.
Okay, so describe your role within the team. In particular, I'm just interested in this title, climate chief climate officer. What does that mean?
Chief Climate Officer is basically a way of drawing attention to the fact that we treat climate and really sustainability at large as a topic of real strategic business importance in the same way that you would with any other sort of C-suite type role. And so the title is really just sort of reflecting the intentionality. In terms of how we work, one of the ways that I sometimes describe the role of corporate team is to think about a sports team. You pick your favorite sports league: football, soccer, cricket, whatever your passion. Essentially, what happens in the business is the operating business units, which we call the segments, some of the product lines that you mentioned in your opening, they're the ones playing the game. So they're the ones trying to score the point, move the ball down the field, win. In this case, win means on climate or packaging or improving the lives of people in our supply chain. What we do as the corporate team is everything else around the league. So we're the scorekeepers, we're the referees, we're the rules committee, we're the coaches, we're all the work that sets up the generic topic of we care about climate and turning it into a specific set of goals and objectives and programs and metrics that the business can then go action against. So our job is to take that ambiguity out and make it something that the broader business can engage their teeth with.
And you engage with a lot of the division heads, right? That's the way that you're.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So in Mars language we call them segments, but
Hmm.
basically they're the global product categories. So we have pet care and food and snacking. And then within those segments there are both full-time sustainability professionals, but arguably even more importantly, all the other business people that are responsible for procurement or manufacturing or marketing. And that's really where the change happens in our performance is not the few strategy people and the few advising people, but the sort of everyday associate, so to speak, and the decisions they make.
And are these folks compensated based on this element of their business?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to my comments about the intentionality behind our work on climate and really sustainability more generally, we've built a whole infrastructure where this is part of what the owners of our business, the Mars family, are asking the business to deliver, and they articulate that through something called the Mars Compass, which talks about four quadrants, some of which are financial performance and some of which are non-financial. And GHGs is part of the positive societal impact quadrant. And that compass cascades not only into what the owners and the board are asking the business to deliver, it then cascades into senior leader compensation as part of that, creating a reinforcing mechanism that will drive the results that we want. And so for the the top 1,600 associates at Mars, which is about the top 1% of the people that work at the business, top by seniority, I should say. This is part of their long-term compensation.
So I mentioned in my intro that Mars grew revenue. I think it actually was like 60% between the time period that we were talking about, 2015 to 2023, while cutting emissions 16%. I think some of that was from acquisitions, right? That revenue growth. We can get into that a little bit more in the moment. But what were the biggest levers for making those cuts? Like what were some of the things that really jump out as, this practical thing really worked?
Yeah, so in the early stages of our decarbonization journey that we've been on so far, and as you mentioned, we're headed for 50%
Yeah.
reduction by 2030. But in that first 16%, probably the biggest contributors are work we've done to tackle deforestation in our supply chains, because that's a significant driver of emissions in a number of agricultural supply chains, and something we've been working very hard on for a long time. Also, we've made a fair amount of progress on renewable electricity in our factories, and then there's sort of a longer tail of other work in other areas, but those are probably two of the biggest. Obviously, our raw material choices make some big differences, but that's a bigger contributor to our plans going forward. I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned, that I'm thrilled you asked about, which is the acquisition. So this is actually something that we take, again, back to the intentionality, that we've taken very seriously. So those numbers of the 60% revenue growth and 16% GHG, those are fully like for like numbers. So we have restated our baselines to account for acquisitions, both in the financial and the GHG calculation there. So those are pure like for like, acquisition included numbers.
When you make an acquisition, how is that evaluated, right? So do you look deeply at what they're doing in sustainability?
Absolutely, or at least as deeply as we can during the acquisition
Right.
process. So the mindset that we bring into acquisitions is at a bare minimum, we make an effort to understand what are the sustainability impacts of that business, and every time we acquire a business, and really anytime anyone acquires a business, they do it with an eye towards the future of, we think we're going to be able to grow this business in certain ways or recognize synergies from cost savings or something. There's a forward plan. So what we do is we say, what's the footprint, to use GHG as an example, what's the footprint today? After we do what we think we're going to do with this business, expand into other markets, launch new products, whatever, what do we think the footprint will be? And then what would we need to solve for in that future footprint to not have this acquisition dilute the performance of Mars? So if Mars is going to get to minus 50% by 2030, this acquisition needs to get to minus 50 by 2030. And then we figure out an estimate of the cost of that, and then actually build that into the business case, so that when we're making a decision and when our board's making a decision about whether or not to acquire a business, the math of the economic math of what will this business model look like after we're solving for sustainability problems at the pace that Mars is solving for sustainability problems, is this still a compelling business to acquire? And it's another example of this whole compass thinking that I spoke about earlier.
So would you walk away from one that didn't meet those metrics?
Well, potentially. I mean, I think that's part of the
Mhm.
challenge that we need to work through, is figuring out, what are good businesses for the future,
Mhm.
and what is sort of the long-term strategic direction. So we have strong financial performance, which is recent backward-looking performance of the business, and then we have something called quality growth. And quality growth is essentially a measure of how much of our business is coming from products or services or markets or categories that are what we would call tailwind, and things that are growing fast and have a long-term role in society. And businesses with heavy sustainability burdens that we don't see a path to solving for, wouldn't really be consistent with quality growth. And so that's absolutely part of the process. And of course, that's all on the risk side. We also recognize there are some businesses where they have products or services that represent opportunities from a sustainability point of view, and that's part of our thinking as well.
Cool. So I want to go back to the two levers that we were talking about a moment ago: deforestation and renewable energy. Let's start with deforestation. Like, what is it specifically that you're doing that has helped? Is it, are these new policies you've put in place? Is it you will only buy from suppliers that, that will only work in certain ways? What were the specific actions you took to address deforestation that have helped so much with that reduction?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few angles on it. So the first is to really understand how much of an impact and an issue deforestation is in your supply chains. You have to know with a fairly high degree of granularity where you're sourcing your raw materials from.
Yeah.
Which again, coming from sort of a history of a lot of these materials being bought and sold as commodities, 10, 20 years ago, that transparency of where specifically, what farm did the materials come from, wasn't there. And even more recently, as you look to get into some of that transparency, often there's, 1,000, and palm oil is a good example. There could be 500 palm oil plantations feeding into one mill. And even once you know you're sourcing from the mill, in principle, you could be sourcing from all 500 of those plantations. And so there's a lot of things about the way supply chains have grown up over the decades that mean you either don't know some of that information you need, or there's so much aggregation and combination of materials that it's quite hard to really get to origin at sort of farm level. So part of the journey is understanding a lot more and investing time and energy in data and traceability and mapping. But of course, that just helps you more sharply dimensionalize the problem. You still then have to do something. And so maybe coming back to Palm, what we did when we did that exercise was we realized when you did that mapping, we were potentially sourcing from almost a third of the palm oil mills on the planet. Mars is nowhere close to buying a third of the palm oil volume on the planet. So we had this very broad exposure. And one of our realizations was that if we could consolidate and reorganize our supply chain, that we would be able to better understand what was going on and then better influence. And so that led to something a number of years ago we called the Palm Positive Plan, where we significantly reduced the number of mills we were sourcing from, which also created the opportunity to be choiceful about which suppliers were doing the best job and were most aligned with our values. And so in that consolidation, there was a sorting of suppliers that we think share our approaches and how we want to move forward. And then even within that, we had much more focused something called a project with some of our suppliers where we did one plantation to one mill to one refinery to Mars to a much more dedicated supply chain. So the point of all that is it's really policies are important, but fundamentally this is a procurement question, right? And unless we buy, you know, who we buy from, what we buy, where we buy, and how we buy it. Some combination of those four factors have to change if we're going to drive a different performance result. And those are things that are really owned by in the case of Mars, we call it commercial, but our procurement function. And we use sustainability insights to inform that, but ultimately we need to embed this in procurement strategy.
So my dad used to go to Brazil and the Ivory Coast and Malaysia and all these other places to do things like take data about the crops. But how are you getting that information that you're talking about? How are you doing that mapping? What technologies or resources on the ground are you using?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit by commodity,
Hmm.
and this has actually been one of the things where not just for Mars, but I think in general, there's been a real explosion in availability of data, both lower cost sensors and drones and better satellite information. So fundamentally, to do that mapping, we need two things. So we need something that tells us where we're sourcing from. So, for example, in cocoa, we've worked with our suppliers and polygon mapped more than 300,000 farms. And polygon map basically means you look at a map and you draw a boundary on a piece of land, which is shaped in like a polygon, and that you say that's a farm that we're sourcing from. So we've mapped, sorry, hundreds of thousands of farms as part of our responsible cocoa program. So you need to know where to look on the map, and then of course you need a map. And there's lots of resources available from things like Global Forest Watch, from the World Resources Institute, that where you've got relatively high frequency satellite mapping of forest cover loss, and by combining those two, you can understand GHG implications of that forest loss in the parts of your supply chain that are subject to that.
I have not mentioned this number before. 60% of your scope 3 is from ag. And so you're doing this mapping not just on palm oil, but you've promised to do this for beef, cocoa, soy, pulp and paper, and of course palm oil by 2025. So can you tell us a little bit about the progress? Like, where are you? You've mentioned palm oil a couple of times. Where does the rest stand?
We're north of 90%, not just mapped, but deforestation free across all of those commodities as of our 2023 reporting. And so are confident we'll continue to progress on that. And so, yeah, the mapping is important, and actually not just for deforestation, but for general sustainability impacts. Knowing our supply chain and origins is critical to how we do the math. But yeah, we're north of 90% across all of those materials.
Great. I want to jump to the renewable energy topic for a moment, um, because you mentioned that as one of the levers at the beginning. What can you offer any specific examples of how again, specific to a factory or a plant location, things you've done to help reduce emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you let me tell a little bit of a history story here. So the thing that got me started working in sustainability was in 2005. My wife and I put solar panels on the roof of our house, and that was a 2 kilowatt installation. 2005. In 2014, I had the privilege to lead the team that did the first large scale offsite renewable electricity project for Mars, which was a wind farm in Texas. That was 200,000 kilowatts. And so that 100,000 X difference between Kevin and the chief climate officer of Mars. So that was the first project we did. And since then, we've done um, almost 10 similar large scale utility offsite projects, not just in the US, but in the UK and Mexico and Australia and more countries all the time. And we're continuing to make that progress. So we're north of 50% of our global electricity is covered by renewables, and we expect that to be in the 90s, 90% plus by 2030.
What about renewable thermal? Because I know that's something you think about as well.
It is. So yeah, while we're very proud of the acceleration, both we and frankly industry at large has been able to deliver on making electricity or sourcing electricity from renewable sources over the last 10 years. Thermal is both a more challenging exercise, and consequently one that I think we and a lot of others are not satisfied with the progress we've been able to make. So a number of years ago, we, along with some other partners, helped launch something called the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. And very briefly, the objective of the Renewable Thermal Collaborative was to figure out how to achieve a hockey stick in deployment and contracting on renewable thermal that we were already seeing happening on renewable electricity, which has really only accelerated since then. And so, thermal is more challenging for a number of reasons, but we're committed to figuring that out, and within the broader suite of our GHG targets, we have a commitment to be 100% renewable energy, not just electricity, but electricity and thermal by 2040 across all of our sites globally.
So one of the things that many individuals are bringing up to me in the last couple months is methane, right? So act on methane. It's a greenhouse gas, short term, super pollutant, et cetera. So how is Mar and Rice, rice, right? So I'm curious about methane from the Mars standpoint. The two ways I think that I've been hearing about it has been the rice, but also dairy. So how are you measuring it, and what progress are you making in reducing that specific greenhouse gas?
Yeah, absolutely. So within our greenhouse gas targets, we include not only everything in scope three. So we do as thorough an accounting of scope three emissions as we can, and those targets of 50% by 2030 are scope one, two, and three combined. We also include all gases. So that's not just a CO2 target. That's got CO2 and methane and N2O and refrigerants in our factories and even anesthetic gases in our veterinary clinics. So we're as complete as we can be in that inventory. And so in that sense, methane has always been part of our program and part of our targets. And if you'd pressed me to list things beyond renewables and deforestation and asked me for a few more, one of the ones that I would have talked about is the work that we've done really over the last 10 years in rice on something called alternate wetting and drying, which is a different production method for rice that helps reduce methane emissions while not negatively impacting yields. And so that's been a focus for a long time that we've deployed into a significant part of our supply base, and we'll continue to push forward and do more of that. Same in dairy. We've looked for many years and done some innovation work with some of our suppliers and piloted some technologies, and now have a new strategy called Moving Forward. I have to get all the O's in there, to work on dairy. And a big part of that is looking at either feed additives or feed management for cows to reduce enteric methane, and then also on the back end manure management and figuring out how to
Literally
make
the
a
back end.
resource
Yeah.
out of that as opposed to just a waste stream.
Literally. Um, so is that like more of a focus, less of I mean, I'm just curious, is it just a ramped up focus then moving into 2025 or?
So yeah, what I would say is, to get to our 50% by 2030 targets, and then certainly our net zero targets by 2050, but even the 50% targets, what we've said about that in our net zero roadmap is that it's affordable and achievable. And the achievable means that we believe by wider deployment of solutions that we know or that we have experimented with, we can make the progress that we need to. And some of the things like dairy methane and alternate wetting and drying to manage methane in rice are definitely in that achievable category, and things that we'll continue to push on and are an important part of that roadmap.
So you can tell us a little bit more about the wetting and drying process, like describe that.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the risk of letting my chemical engineering roots show, so the traditional production practice for rice is to fully flood the fields throughout the entire growing cycle, and that works because rice is happy growing with its feet underwater. And the reason farmers do it is it helps with weed suppression, because while rice is growing happy with its feet underwater, most other plants aren't. So it's a pretty effective way of suppressing weeds. The challenge is there is organic matter in the soil, and that organic matter in the soil under the water is in anaerobic conditions. And organic material breaking down under anaerobic conditions leads to methane. And so the trick is you could not flood at all, but then you'd have weeds, or you can flood, but then you have methane. And the alternate wetting and drying is the cycle where you do enough flooding to suppress the weeds, but enough drying to minimize the amount of methane being produced. And so it's sort of finding that optimum. And then, again, although well, there's room to argue whether the primary motivation is methane or not, but from a farmer's point of view, there's an opportunity to use less water. And that water savings can be really material in water stressed locations which is one helpful to the farmer from a cost point of view, and actually also contributes to one of Mars's other objectives, which is to reduce the use of unsustainable water in stressed watersheds.
So all of these things you're talking about require a lot of cooperation from the supply chain, right? So how do you make it economically viable for that farmer or the, whatever operation to do this work, to adopt these practices?
Yeah, this is a great question, and really probably the thing that is most central to whether a business like Mars or anyone else will be able to achieve their targets is, we've got to really understand not just the sort of technical uh, mechanics of what we're doing. So the articulation I just gave through of anaerobic conditions, right? We also need to understand the decision making context in which that farmer is making their choices, and the role of the supplier that perhaps sits between us and that farmer, and really understanding that business ecosystem. And that's where the connection between sort of the sustainability experts and the people that own those procurement relationships is really so critical, is figuring out what's to use one of the Mars 5 principles, what's the mutual solution that benefits everyone, that sometimes means a very different way of contracting and working together. So it can be, longer term contracts, it can be more strategic relationships, it can be upfront investments that Mars makes in training or education, or in some cases even some of the equipment, hardware assets to enable these transformations. And depending on the particular supply chain and the partners and the particular problems, we've done some, many, or all of those things to help enable some of these transformations that we'd like to see.
We're going to go into a speed round in a moment, but before I do that, I want to ask you what you think your biggest impediment is to making reductions, right? So you've got to cover 16 to 50% in the next 5 years. Like, what's your biggest obstacle? What's the biggest impediment? And you're laughing because yes, it's hard.
Yes. It's a bit philosophical, but I actually think the biggest impediment is getting people to recognize what they don't know. So, if you ask someone who's, trained as a mechanical engineer to design a better fan, they're building on hundreds of years of engineering fan design, and so they really know the constraints of the problem that they're trying to solve. If you ask that same individual to design a decarbonization strategy, they don't have 100 textbooks they can go look at. They didn't get taught about this in school. They don't they don't have the knowledge base that we do on a lot of the other problems that we try and solve in engineering or in business in general. And too often I see, and it happens at Mars, it happens everywhere else. Too often I see people falling into the trap of like, I don't see how to do this, so it must not be possible, right? Without recognizing that actually we need to challenge ourselves to look more broadly and build the knowledge base that doesn't exist today.
Yeah. So how do you win that support? Like, how do you get over that?
So I think a lot of it comes down to asking leading questions, really getting into understanding the mechanics of how things work, and you know doing a lot of again, it's sort of an engineering term, doing a lot of what's called sort of 5 why analysis, where you ask, why does this work this way? Well, because we've always done it that way. Well, why have you always done it that way? Well, because that's the guy that taught me to do it, right? And you keep digging and really get to sort of the root cause of things, and sometimes in that process you can open up ideas. The other one that it sort of relates to that is all of us, certainly in business, operate within in our jobs within a particular set of rules. Someone either in the past or more senior than us has created that rule set, which means those rule sets can be changed, right? So if you're an everyday buyer of a commodity at Mars, transitioning from spot market procurement to long-term contracts is not within the rule set that you're allowed to operate within. But there is someone in the business at a more senior level who can say, actually, we could make an argument to do this a different way and change the rules. And I think that's what really helps unlock a lot of innovation and creativity.
So I'm laughing because my father probably would have been very unhappy with some of these changes. That he was an absolute he was a traitor. So the quick speed round here. Who's on your reoccurring meeting list and why?
All of my direct reports are on the recurring list because we have so much to talk about. It's usually more efficient to just have blocks in the calendar and then cover what needs to be covered. And then also the leaders of the sustainability work in our business segments are on my list. And then the last one that I would call out is our financial controller. So we spend a lot of time working on quality and rigor of our data, and that's an important part of what we're trying to drive.
How do you handle eco anxiety?
I am personally, unfortunately, a bit pessimistic at the large scale, um, but my point of view is that the the challenges that we're facing, on climate or water or packaging or lots of other areas are in many cases more a challenge of sort of will and intentionality than a techno economic feasibility problem. And the reason that gives me some, which is on the one hand frustrating, but on the other hand, I think, gives me some hope because I think we just never know what's going to be the thing that that tips over the mindset and changes people's political calculus and suddenly unleashes the technologies that we know could be implemented at scale. And so I'm optimistic because at a small scale there's a lot of amazing exciting work we can do, and you never know when one of those projects is going to be the domino that drives the bigger, broader change that we all want to see in the world.
What do you ask every job candidate?
So this is a great question. So this is like a running joke inside of Mars. I've had the privilege of interviewing many people over the years, and my first question is always exactly the same question, which is, tell me the 5 minute story that starts wherever you want. You can start last week, you can start with your third grade science teacher, but end the story with, and that's why I'm here today talking to you about this role. So I can read your resume, but tell me the story that explains why we're having a conversation.
I love that. That's great. I'm gonna have to remember that. Uh, two more. What is your most successful strategy for motivating teams?
I think, and maybe I'll talk in the context of the team that reports to me. I'm a big believer in that. As a manager, your job is not to oversee the work of the people that work for you. Your job is to help set up their work, be there when they need help, and clear roadblocks when they need it. And so my job as a manager is not to do your job or oversee what you're doing. It's to make it easier for you to do your job. And so I think that sort of applies to teams as well. Is if you're one of the more senior folks on a team, your job is to enable everybody else to be more effective. Because again, a little bit like the procurement strategy conversation we had earlier, is there are doors as a senior leader that you can unlock. There are rules you can bend that others can't. And sometimes, 10 minutes of your time can be worth 8 hours of someone else's time, not because you're better or smarter, but because you have the authority to change some of the rules that others can't.
Final question. It sounds like you're very grounded in reality, but who can you count on for a reality check?
I think it depends on the topic. So we've always built our program on science and numbers and math. So the first place I'll always go to is the data, because I think that has to be the starting point for what's feasible. Um, After that, I think we have we have we've built up over the years so many experts at Mars that have really built up competencies that it's really hard to pick one that I would go to consistently. But I think he's retiring, but I've really valued the collaboration that I've had with Barry Parkin over the years. I think he brings a real background again from sort of this procurement mindset, which I think is really powerful. And so I think that's probably that's probably my short answer.
Okay. Kevin, I really appreciate your time today. It's so great to catch up with you. Thank you so much for joining me on Climate Pioneers.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here, and it was great to chat with you.